In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the rear brakes, pads, and rotors on this Ford F-150. Keep in mind that throughout this generation, which is the 09 to 14 generation, Ford put two different rear ends in this. The early model, 09 to 11, is going to have one style, and 12 to 14 is going to have a different style, so make sure you pick the ones that fit your truck. Let's take the wheel off, use a 21mm socket, and remove all 6 of your lug nuts. Now remove the wheel. Before we pull the caliper off, stick a pry bar or a screwdriver right in between the slots of the rotor here, or the slot of the caliper, and just pry on it a little bit. Sometimes that releases the pressure off of the piston. It can move around a little, and that allows you to take it off easier once it's unbolted. Speaking of unbolting it, 2 13mm bolts hold this caliper onto its bracket. Let's remove both of them. Now you can pull the caliper off, and I'm going to set it aside right on the leaf spring so it doesn't put any pressure on this brake hose. To remove the pad, you might need a pry bar. Do this to both. A lot of times they get stuck in here. If they slide off, that's even better. While we're here, let's remove these anti-rattle clips that hold the pads on. Where the pads slide, just pry them up and off. We'll have to clean up this area underneath them. There we go. Next, use an 18mm socket. Remove these 2 bolts that hold the caliper bracket onto the axle. Leave this one partially threaded in so it can support it while you take off the top one. Now take them both off and set the caliper bracket aside. Now let's remove the rotor, wiggle it until it comes off. If it doesn't come off, it's either seized on the axle, the hub part of the axle here, or on the e-brake shoes, and I'll show you how to get those off or de-adjust them to release the rotor once it's off, so I can show you a little bit better. But for me, looks like I'm able to wiggle it off, which should be the case for you as well. There we go. Set that aside. If you can't get the rotor off and you think the parking brake shoes are what's holding it on, you have this little rubber cap here. Pop this off, and with that off, you get access to the adjuster, which is that star gear looking wheel here. And if you spin it, it should contract the shoes and release them off of the rotor. Next, I want to degrease the hub surface on the axle with brake parts cleaner. I'm also going to spray around the parking brake shoes. That way I don't get any more dust up in the air. Now let's clean up the axle surface where the rotor sits. You want to make sure it's nice and flat. Mine is pretty clean, so I'm just using a wire brush with some brake parts cleaner. If yours has a lot of rust buildup, you're going to want to sand it flat, but just make sure you don't remove too much material. Now take the rotor, slide it on here. I know I have a new rotor. It doesn't matter if you're reusing your old one. At this point, you want to make sure that you can hear the shoes touch the sides here, not continuously and not a lot, because this is just a parking brake. This is not a drum brake setup, so you don't want resistance on here. If it does have resistance, they will heat up, expand, and then it could even lock up your wheel as you're driving down the road. Definitely want to avoid that. But you do want them to be close. Otherwise, when you apply the parking brake, it'll take a lot of travel in that parking brake pedal to actually engage and lock up the wheel as you're parked. So we want to get them close. At this point, I can't hear anything. It's going to be difficult, especially because the other side wheel is going to want to spin. What you're hearing is actually the other side. It's not this side at all. So let's take the rotor back off and expand these shoes a little bit through the adjuster. You can do that easily with a pry bar or a screwdriver. And if you just spin this little adjuster wheel, this should push the shoes out. All right, now I hear them touch. All right, so I would say these are adjusted properly. Now we have to take this back off, and let's coat the hub with anti-seize so it doesn't rust. Try to avoid getting the anti-seize on the brake shoes and on the lug studs. You don't need a whole lot, just enough to coat the metal so that it, like I said, doesn't rust in the future. Now take your rotor, and I like to put it on backwards at first so I can clean the surface. Use brake parts cleaner and degrease the surface of the brake pad as well as the surface of the parking brake shoes. There are oils on here from the factory, so it doesn't rust when it's on the shelf. You want to get all these oils off. Flip it over. install it the right way. Let's degrease this surface as well, the same way. Brake parts cleaner and a rag. Just like that. Now let's get the caliper bracket prepared for installation. We have to do a couple different things. One is going to be cleaning up these areas where the anti-rattle clips sit. These sit right onto the caliper bracket. We have to get rid of all of this rust so that the new ones don't sit too far up. If they sit too far up on both sides, it actually reduces the distance between the two sides and the pads will get jammed here. They won't slide properly. So you definitely want to make sure that this is nice and clean. I have some pretty decent rust buildup here. And I'm going to start with just a wire brush on a drill. If that doesn't do the trick, I will have to sand it down. I'm going to use a very gentle sanding pad, not very abrasive. I don't want to remove material because the thing is, if you remove too much, the anti-rattle clips will slide on very easily, not lock on, and they can pop off just as easily. So that's not good. So just start slow, work your way up to whatever you need to get this nice and clean. Hopefully yours isn't too bad, and you can just use a wire brush. Of course, do the same to both sides. Next, I want to clean up the slider pins. It looks like these have really good grease in them still, so all I'm going to do is just wipe the old grease off, inspect it. It's good condition still. If it was rotted and it was in poor condition, definitely replace it. You don't want to use this when it's not going to hold up. Having said that, let's apply new grease. I'm using silicone paste that is rated for brakes, for high temperature. It's important. If you don't have this, you can use brake grease. Don't put a lot on it. I like to also put some inside the boot, just a little bit. This will act as a reserve of grease, and putting it inside the boot also makes it so that it gets on this outer lip here, which will in turn apply it to the cutout on the pin where the boot seals up. It's important that you do that. That's what prevents water and other debris from getting in there. You want it to be a perfectly tight seal. Give it a few twists, and then of course we'll do the same to the other side. And I like to do these one at a time because a lot of times they have this rubber damper in here, and it's important that the damper, the pin with the damper, goes back on the same side that it came out of. Do the same over here. Apply some silicone paste or brake grease, whatever you have. Put a little bit inside of the boot, work it, and slide the pin down to squeeze any excess air or grease out. Just squeeze it, press it in, and squeeze the boot. Wipe off any extra, give it a few twists, and there we go. Now, if you had rust buildup in here, after you pull the slider pin out, you'd want to use a bore brush, which is just the wire brush that's long, and you put it in here on a drill, spin it around with some brake parts cleaner in there, and that's how you would get the rust out. But of course, if it's too severe and it's not savable, you're going to want to replace this. You want to make sure that these slide smoothly by the time you're done, just like this. If they don't, you will have uneven brake wear and potentially braking issues. One more thing I want to do is apply a thin layer of grease or silicone paste right here where the anti-rattle clips go, in hopes that this will, over time, slow the rust down and allow it to not build up even more. You want to make sure you put this on both sides, and then we'll put the new anti-rattle clips on. If you don't put grease on here and you already have rust buildup, most likely what's going to happen is it's going to keep rusting. It'll swell up and raise those anti-rattle clips, and what I mentioned earlier will happen is they will squeeze the pads in. You won't have pads that can slide smoothly anymore, which is going to be an issue. Take the anti-rattle clips. They only go on one way, and that's with the larger hooks facing outwards and up. You want to hook them over. This is going to be a little bit difficult, especially since they're a little slippery now with the grease. Slide these down. It's normal for them to be a very snug fit. If they're not, that's actually a problem because they need to lock in nice and tight here. There we go. That's one side, and that's the other side. As you can see, it doesn't move. That's what you want. And Basically, if you sand too much down, it'll just come off of here, and that's not good. It looks like the best way to do it is with 2 hands, apply constant pressure until it pops on. There we go. Get one side on first, then press the other side in. And now the caliper bracket is ready for installation, so let's put it back on the truck. Take the caliper bracket and line it up. Let's put the 2 bolts through. Bottom them out, and the torque for these is 122 foot-pounds. Now take the pads and let's put those on. Make sure these little ears hook onto the sliders here, the caliper bracket. Make sure that rotor's sitting flush also if it happens to pop off. And the outer one, you can pry these out just a little bit, just enough to slide these in. Make sure your pads, oops, this one slides nice and smooth, that's why it just popped out. They have to slide smoothly like this. If they're seized, likely you didn't clean up enough, and you need to sand it down a little more and make space for these pads to slide in and out smoothly. Now grab the caliper, and before we put it on, we have to compress the piston, push it back in, because as you can see, it needs more room to fit the new pads. To do this, you can either use some large pliers or a caliper depression tool of your choice. They make different styles. Basically, go very slow, press this piston back in. There we go. Make sure it goes in nice and smoothly like this one. If it doesn't, likely the caliper is seized. Make sure this boot doesn't get completely crushed in there. This is just a dust boot. And inspect it as you do this. If you see fluid here, likely the caliper is bad, the seal inside, and it's leaking externally. That is not good. You need to address that by replacing the caliper. Now that this is pushed in all the way, let's get a little pocket screwdriver, and if this happens to yours where the dust boot kind of squishes out like this, well, sometimes you can even do it by hand, but just push it back in so it doesn't get crushed between the piston and the pad. There we go. Now slide the caliper over, make sure it lines up with the bracket, and you can put the 2 little bolts in that hold it onto the slider pins. Bottom them out, and the torque for these is 22 foot-pounds, so it's not a lot. Keep that in mind as you bottom this out. Torque them. 1 and 2. That's 22 foot-pounds on both. If your slider pin starts spinning as you're trying to spin the bolt side, just hold it with some pliers or a wrench here. Just make sure you don't crush the boot when you do that. Now let's put the wheel on, and don't forget to pump up your brakes so that the pad can be seated up against the rotor. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all of your lug nuts and then tighten them to 150 foot-pounds. $150 in a cross pattern. Here we go. There you have it. Don't forget to pump up your brakes and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.